The day my parents disowned me, I remember the smell of coffee burning in the kitchen. It was early morning, still dark outside, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, clutching my acceptance letter with trembling hands. My dream had come true. I had been accepted into one of the top creative writing programs in the country, but when I showed it to them, they didn't smile. My father just looked at me, stone-faced, and said, "So you're really going to waste your life on this?" My mother sighed, picked up her phone, and didn't even look at me when she said, "We're done supporting your delusions." What came next still echoes in my mind like a nightmare I can't wake up from. They called me a disappointment, a failure, useless. Then, my father said the words that changed everything. "If you walk out that door, don't ever come back." I didn't walk. I ran. No money, no home, just a suitcase, a broken heart, and the echo of their rejection ringing in my ears. I slept on couches. I worked night shifts in diners and spent my days writing in coffee shops, trying to hold on to a dream they told me would destroy me. And maybe it almost did. But now, years later, my books are on bestseller lists. My face is on magazines. The failure they threw away is now someone they can't ignore. And guess what? They called me last week, after 7 years of silence. Suddenly, I'm their precious daughter again. They want to talk, to reconnect, to pretend none of it happened. But I remember. I remember every word, every silence, every slammed door. And now, I get to choose. Should I forgive? Or should I let them feel just a little of what I felt? Because this is not just a story about being disowned. It's about rising from the ashes and deciding who gets to stand in your light once you've built it yourself. So tell me, if you were in my place, would you take them back? Or would you shut the door the same way they did? Comment below before we continue. And don't forget to subscribe, because what's coming next might just surprise you. Looking back, I don't know exactly when the doubt began. Maybe it was always there, like a faint buzzing in the background that you don't notice until the room goes quiet. Maybe I just didn't want to hear it. I was too busy trying to believe that my parents loved me the way parents are supposed to. I grew up in a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood. White fences, freshly cut lawns, polite smiles. But inside our house, things were different. Not violent, not loud, just cold. Everything was conditional. Love, praise, attention. It all had to be earned. My parents were obsessed with appearances. They wanted to be admired. My father ran his own company, and my mother was a retired corporate attorney. To the outside world, they were impressive, successful, powerful. Inside our home, they were critical, calculating, disappointed in anything that didn't align with their definition of success. And I was the artistic child. I liked books more than sports, solitude more than socializing. I wrote poetry, drew in the margins of my notebooks, daydreamed too much. I was gentle in a family that worshipped strength. At first, I didn't realize they saw that as a flaw, but I started noticing small things. When my brother Daniel brought home a B+ on a math test, my dad said, "You're slipping, aim higher." But when he made varsity football, they invited all our neighbors over to celebrate. I got straight A's and won second place in a national short story competition. My mom's response? "That's nice. But what are you going to do with that?" I didn't understand. I thought maybe they were just tough love kind of parents, the kind that pushed you so you could grow. But over time, the pushing started to feel more like tearing. The first real crack appeared on a Sunday morning. We were at brunch with a group of my dad's business friends. Someone asked how the kids were doing. My dad beamed about Daniel's recent internship with a Wall Street firm. Then someone turned to my mom and said, "And your daughter? The writer, right?" She rolled her eyes and gave this tight-lipped smile that still burns in my memory. "Oh, her? She's still playing with her little stories. We're hoping it's just a phase." They laughed. I didn't. I forced a smile and stirred my coffee until it was cold. I couldn't speak. My throat tightened like a fist around every word I wanted to say. That night, I confronted her. "Why did you say that about me?" She shrugged. "Because it's true. Don't be so sensitive." That phrase, "don't be so sensitive," was a recurring chorus in my life. Whenever I cried, got quiet, or tried to express myself, those words would land like a slap across the face. Too emotional, too dramatic, too fragile. The message was clear. My emotions were a defect. My dreams were a joke. I was not the child they wanted. I started to question everything about myself. Was I lazy? Unrealistic? Immature? My self-worth unraveled thread by thread, not in one big dramatic moment, but in a slow, painful erosion of confidence. And the worst part? I blamed myself. I thought, if I were just more like Daniel, if I could just stop being so sensitive, if I could just be someone they were proud of. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. One evening, I came home from school excited to tell them I'd been chosen to lead a regional youth writing program. I even got a small scholarship. I had worked so hard for it. I remember walking into the kitchen, finding them both at the table, going over paperwork. I was smiling, clutching the acceptance letter. I got the coordinator position for the regional youth writing mentorship. They picked me, out of over 100 applicants. My mom didn't even look up. Will that take time away from your SAT prep? My dad just said. Does it pay? No, I replied, my smile faltering. It's for experience. He shook his head and returned to his spreadsheet. That night, I cried in the shower. Not because they didn't throw me a party, or hug me, or tell me how proud they were, but because I finally realized they never would. It was the first time I allowed myself to think it. Maybe they don't believe in me. Maybe they never have. That doubt settled in my chest like a stone. Heavy, cold, permanent. But what I didn't know then, what they couldn't see, was that underneath that doubt, something stronger was quietly taking root. A quiet fire. A hunger to prove them wrong. To rise, not for them, but in spite of them. This was just the beginning. They say a mother always knows. But no one talks about what happens when you know, and your mother just doesn't care. After that brunch incident and the cold indifference toward my scholarship, something in me shifted. I stopped trying to impress them. Not out of rebellion, at least not at first. I just got tired. Tired of twisting myself into a version of their ideal daughter. Tired of pretending that their silence didn't hurt more than insults ever could. Tired of hiding the real me just to keep their approval. At school, my teachers encouraged me to write. Some even pulled me aside and said things like, "You've got a gift, don't waste it." At home, my mother told me, "Dreams don't pay bills." I started keeping things to myself. Wins especially. I knew the outcome. My parents didn't clap. They calculated. If it didn't come with a paycheck, it wasn't worth discussing. But even as I distanced myself emotionally, I still lived under their roof, still relied on their financial support. And that made everything more complicated. My dad had a habit of asking me, almost mockingly, "So what's the plan, future author?" He said the word author like it tasted bad in his mouth. I'd shrug and mutter something about publishing, maybe editing. He'd roll his eyes and say, "That's not a plan. That's a fantasy." At night, when the house was quiet, I'd lie awake and replay every interaction, every eye roll, every snide comment. Every time they made me feel like the odd one out in my own home, that's when the whisper started. The voice in the back of my mind that said, "You're not crazy. This isn't love. This is control." It got louder when I caught my mother going through my journal. I'd left it in my room, under my pillow. Stupid, I know. But I never thought she'd actually read it. She didn't even try to hide it. She sat on my bed, flipping through pages like it was her right. When I walked in and froze, she looked up and said, "You really think anyone's going to publish this?" I couldn't even speak. That night, I moved the journal into a locked box and started writing only on my laptop, password protected. I didn't feel safe in my own house anymore, not because of violence, but because of emotional invasion. The next week, I turned down a paid summer internship my dad had arranged for me at a company he partnered with. It was for data entry and office admin work. Nothing to do with writing. When I said no, he exploded. "You think you're too good for real work now?" "No," I answered quietly. "I just want to focus on things that align with what I'm studying." "You're studying bullshit," he snapped, "and we're wasting money supporting it." My mom stood beside him, arms crossed. She didn't say a word. That was the moment I realized something painful. They didn't want me to succeed, not as me. They wanted to mold me into someone they could be proud of at dinner parties. The real me? The sensitive, creative, dream-filled me? They were ashamed of her. After that fight, I started spending more time away from home, studying at cafes, staying late at the campus library, crashing at friends' places when things got tense. I was avoiding them, yes, but I was also building something in secret. I had started a blog, anonymous, of course, where I published weekly stories, essays, and little pieces of my life. I didn't tell anyone it was me, but the blog started gaining traction. Comments trickled in. People related to my writing. Some even called it healing. I read those comments in the dark, alone in my room, while the house slept around me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen, validated, like my voice mattered. Meanwhile, at home, the distance grew. My parents thought I was just going through a phase, like always. They made passive-aggressive comments about me being antisocial, immature, selfish, but they didn't see what was happening beneath the surface. I was planning, preparing, growing stronger. I started saving every dollar I earned from tutoring and freelancing. I quietly applied to transfer from my small community college to a competitive university out of state. I didn't tell them. Not until the acceptance letter arrived. That day is still etched in my memory. I walked into the kitchen with the envelope in hand. My dad was scrolling through his phone. My mom was sipping tea, flipping through a catalog. I got in, I said. Full scholarship. University of Chicago. They both looked up, blinked, said nothing. Creative writing and comparative literature? I added, forcing a smile. My mom set her cup down. And what do you expect us to do about that? I paused. Nothing, I said. Absolutely nothing. And for the first time, I realized what I was really building. Freedom. When I finally left for Chicago, I didn't cry. I thought I would. I thought I'd feel some kind of grief or fear. But instead, I felt this quiet, powerful peace. Like taking off a heavy coat I didn't realize I'd been wearing my entire life. I didn't tell my parents when I moved into the dorm. I didn't send them photos. I didn't ask them for anything. They didn't reach out either. I had expected some kind of message. A passive-aggressive text, at least. But no, just silence. Like they were trying to prove a point. Like they wanted to show me that I needed them. But I didn't. The university felt like a rebirth. I was surrounded by people who saw the world through emotion and metaphor, not just metrics and money. My professors encouraged my writing like it was a muscle worth strengthening, not a distraction. I joined a workshop group. Every Thursday night, we sat in a circle, reading our stories out loud, giving feedback, laughing, crying. It was the first time I felt like I was speaking a language that everyone around me understood. And then, one night, something strange happened. I submitted a short story to a student journal. Just something small, about a girl who grows up invisible in her own family, who eventually builds her own world from words. When it got accepted, I didn't think much of it, until I got an email from an editor of a small indie press who had read it and wanted to talk about a possible manuscript. At first I thought it was a scam, but it wasn't. That conversation turned into more conversations. A sample chapter turned into a draft. And within 6 months, I had signed a deal to publish my first book. It felt surreal. I was only 20. I hadn't even finished my degree. I didn't tell my parents. Why would I? They hadn't asked a single question since I left. Not about my classes, my life, my writing. I hadn't heard their voices in over a year. But then, something happened that changed everything. My brother posted about me. He had seen a press release about my upcoming novel. It was being highlighted in a young writers to watch list. I guess he felt proud. He always treated me better than they did, though he rarely stood up to them. His caption was simple. Proud of my little sister. Told you she was going to do big things. That post got shared. A lot. Suddenly I was getting tagged, messaged, followed. And then, my phone rang. An unknown number. I answered out of curiosity. Hello? Silence. Then a voice I hadn't heard in over a year. Hi, it's your mother. I froze. I stepped out of the library and into the cold night air, heart pounding. I saw the article, she said. Your brother shared it. I waited. I just wanted to say, congratulations. It sounded foreign on her tongue, like she had to force it out. Thanks, I said flatly. We didn't know you were doing so well, she added. That was the first revelation. Not that they had noticed me, but that now, after all the years of silence, they were curious. She kept talking, asking how I was, saying she and my dad had been thinking about me, that they missed me, that we should talk more. I hung up the phone and stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, trying to feel something, anything, but all I felt was this sharp, cold clarity. They didn't miss me. They missed the success, the image, the ability to say, "That's our daughter." The invisible girl they pushed away was now a name people recognized. Now I mattered, because the world said I did. It made me sick. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice, soft and suddenly gentle. We should talk more. Like the last few years had been some sort of misunderstanding. Like they hadn't deliberately erased me from their lives. That's when I realized this wasn't about reconciliation. This was about reputation. And that realization, that bitter truth, was the moment something hardened in me. They hadn't changed. They didn't regret what they'd done. They just regretted that now the world could see me thriving without them. And that's when I knew I wasn't done with this story yet. I guess a part of me still wanted to believe, not in some fairy tale ending, not that they'd magically turn into warm, nurturing parents, but maybe that they felt something. Regret, maybe, or guilt. Maybe, just maybe, they had realized what they'd done. That hope, tiny and bruised, was the only reason I agreed to meet them. We met at a quiet restaurant near their neighborhood. I chose it intentionally. Somewhere neutral, public, easy to leave. When I walked in, my heart was pounding. My palms were sweating. I felt like I was walking into an ambush. And deep down, I knew I was. They were already seated when I arrived. My mother stood up and kissed my cheek like we were old friends, not strangers pretending we had a shared history worth salvaging. My father gave me a firm nod, like a businessman greeting a colleague. Polite, distant, controlled. We sat. They asked about my book. I kept it simple. They asked about my classes. I gave short answers. I wasn't there to bond. I was there to see what this really was. And then it happened. My mother pulled out her phone and showed me a picture of a sleek, modern house. "We're thinking of moving," she said, her voice light. "Somewhere closer to the city. Maybe a neighborhood with more creatives. Artists. Like you." I just nodded, unsure where this was going. She kept scrolling and then turned the screen toward me again. "We've been talking," she continued, "about starting a foundation. Something in your name." I blinked. "A foundation?" "For young writers," she smiled. "Disadvantaged kids. A mentorship program. Your name would carry it, of course." My stomach dropped. "You'd be the face," my father added casually. "We'd handle the logistics. PR, finances. You'd just show up when needed. Smile for the camera. Say something inspiring." My mouth went dry. I stared at them, trying to process what I was hearing. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about branding. My parents, who had called me a failure, who told me to leave and never come back, now wanted to use me, to clean up their image, to ride the wave of my success, to wear my achievements like they had something to do with them. It wasn't love. It was strategy. I sat in stunned silence as they kept talking, about target demographics, potential media coverage, corporate sponsors. They'd already thought it all through. "We could make it a family thing," my mother said. "Like a legacy." A legacy. The audacity nearly made me laugh. They had ignored my existence for years, and now they wanted to turn me into a legacy project. That was the moment it all clicked into place. The silence after I left home hadn't been passive. It had been intentional. Punishment. And now their interest wasn't emotional. It was transactional. This wasn't a reunion. This was a negotiation. I looked at them, really looked at them, and for the first time, I saw them not as my parents, but as people. Flawed, self-serving, emotionally hollow people. People who had built their identities around power, control, and image. And now, because I had become something they could no longer ignore, they wanted in. Not for me, for themselves. I excused myself from the table and went to the restroom, locked the stall door, sat on the toilet lid and buried my face in my hands. I didn't cry. I just sat there, breathing slowly, letting the truth settle like cement in my chest. There would be no apology. No acknowledgement of the pain they caused. No conversation about the years they erased me. They weren't sorry. They were opportunists. And this slick, manipulative attempt to reinsert themselves into my life was worse than being disowned, because now I knew exactly what I was worth to them. I returned to the table and sat down calmly. They looked up, expectantly. I smiled, polite, composed. "I'll think about it," I said. Their eyes lit up, just for a moment. That was all I needed. They thought I was back, that I was theirs again, but they had no idea. They didn't know what I was really planning. They didn't know that their little performance had just sealed their fate. They didn't know that I had already decided how this would end. They had disowned me when I was weak. Now they were crawling back because I was powerful. And I was going to make them regret every second of it. I didn't go back to my dorm after that lunch. I walked aimlessly for over an hour, through busy sidewalks and past crowded cafes, letting the city swallow me whole. People moved around me like waves, laughing, running, yelling into phones, and I felt like I was underwater, distant, numb. I should have expected it. I did expect it, and yet it still hurt. Not because I wanted their approval, not anymore. It hurt because for a few seconds, I had hoped they'd changed. That little voice inside me, the one that still sounded like a teenage girl, had whispered, "Maybe this time they'll see you. Maybe they'd remember I was their daughter before I became a headline." But no, they didn't want me. They wanted what I represented, a shiny, successful product of their parenting, a trophy they abandoned, only to try and reclaim now that it had become valuable. And that realization, it broke something in me. When I finally got back to my dorm that night, I curled up on the floor. Not the bed, the floor. I needed something solid beneath me, something real. The tears didn't come right away, but when they did, they wouldn't stop. I cried like I was bleeding, and in a way, I was. Because it wasn't just the lunch. It wasn't just the foundation talk or the PR plan. It was the years I'd spent believing I was the problem, that I wasn't enough, that if I just worked harder, became better, more impressive, they'd love me. That belief had lived inside me like a parasite, feeding off every success, twisting each win into a question. Are they proud now? Did I earn it yet? And now that I had earned it, all of it, they still didn't love me. They didn't even know me. They never wanted to. I thought about every moment I'd sat across the dinner table from them, desperate for connection. Every paper I'd left on the kitchen counter, hoping for a good job. Every poem I wrote trying to explain my heart, only to be met with silence. All of it. Dismissed. Erased. And yet, I had clung to their absence like it was my fault. That was the cruelest part. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was slow. It was layered. It had been happening for years. And I hadn't even known how to name it until now. This wasn't just about being disowned. It was about never being claimed in the first place. And that realization? That was the final crack in the shell of who I used to be. I lay on the floor, gripping my pillow, letting the grief come in waves. I grieved the parents I wished I'd had, the childhood I never got, the little girl inside me who spent so long thinking love had to be earned. And then, I remembered something, a memory I hadn't thought about in years. I was 10. It was raining. I had written a short story about a girl who could turn invisible whenever people said mean things to her. I showed it to my mom. She barely skimmed it and said, "Why don't you go play outside?" I had run into the backyard, barefoot in the wet grass, and cried under the tree, holding that story against my chest like it was a piece of my soul. That memory gutted me. Because I realized something. They had never seen my writing as an expression of who I was. To them, it was always a problem, a distraction, a failure to conform. But to me, it had been survival. Writing was how I made sense of the world, how I stayed alive when no one else seemed to care if I did. They couldn't see the worth in it, but I had built my entire future on it. I wiped my face, stood up, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red, my face blotchy. But I saw something else there too. Resolve. I wasn't that little girl under the tree anymore. And if they thought they could rewrite the narrative now, twist it to their benefit, they were wrong. So wrong. They had underestimated me once. They would not get that chance again. That night, I didn't just mourn. I decided. I decided that I wasn't going to let them turn my story into a lie. They wanted to pretend they had supported me all along? Fine. I'd let the world see the truth. Not through confrontation, not with shouting or revenge, but with the one thing they always ignored: my words. Because if there was one thing I had now that they could never take from me, it was my voice, and I was going to use it. People think revenge is this loud, dramatic thing, screaming, slamming doors, exposing secrets. But the most satisfying kind? It's quiet, strategic, surgical. And mine began with a pen. Well, a keyboard, technically. That night, after crying myself empty, I opened my laptop and started writing. Not fiction, not poetry. The truth. For years, I had hidden behind characters and metaphors. I told stories that hinted at pain, but never called it by name. But now, I was done hiding. I wrote a personal essay, raw, honest, and terrifying to type. I didn't name names, but I didn't have to. It was about growing up in a household that only valued perfection, about being erased by the people who were supposed to nurture you, about rebuilding yourself from scratch when the very people who broke you came knocking again, pretending nothing had happened. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the narrative. I submitted it to a popular online platform for emerging writers. I almost didn't hit send. I stared at the screen for a solid 5 minutes, my finger hovering over the trackpad. But then I thought, they took so much from me. My confidence, my voice, my home. They do not get to have my silence too. I clicked submit. 2 days later, it was published. Within a week, it went viral. I watched the numbers climb. Shares, comments, reposts. Thousands of people messaged me, telling me they saw themselves in my words, that they felt less alone, that they had lived that same quiet heartbreak. And then, the media requests came in, podcasts, interviews, panels about healing family wounds and breaking generational cycles. My book sales doubled. And my parents? Oh, they noticed. I got a text from my dad. This article, we need to talk. Followed by a call. Followed by my mother's voice, cold but controlled. Do you realize how this makes us look? Yes. Yes, I did. That was the point. But I didn't respond. Not yet. Because I wasn't finished. My publisher called me 2 weeks later and said, "This is bigger than your book. People want you. They want the story behind the story." And that's when the plan came into focus. I pitched a new project, a memoir, not a tell-all, not a revenge book, but a map. A story about how to survive being disowned, not just physically but emotionally. About how to grow something beautiful in the space where love should have been. About how to forgive yourself before forgiving anyone else. And buried in the chapters would be the truth about my parents. Not exposed with cruelty, but laid bare with clarity. Because there's nothing more devastating to people who care about appearances than being seen exactly as they are. I told my editor I'd need full creative control. She agreed. I began writing that same night. Every chapter was a release. Every paragraph felt like pulling out a thorn I'd been living with for years. I wrote the shame, the silence, the small humiliations no one ever talks about, the subtle wounds that stay long after the bruises would have healed. I also wrote about strength, about rebuilding, about found family, the friends who cheered me on, the professors who saw my light, the mentors who reminded me I was worth more than approval. The more I wrote, the less power my parents had over me. And that was when they really started to panic. They emailed, they called, they even sent a long letter, handwritten, trying to explain themselves. Not apologize, explain. They wanted me to understand their pressure, their sacrifices, the generational trauma, the expectations, the culture, the stress. But you know what word they never used? Sorry. Not once. So I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had a bigger response coming. What would you do if the people who broke you tried to come back, only after you became someone they couldn't ignore? Would you forgive, or would you show them who you became without them? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you'd do. And if you're still with me, hit subscribe. Because trust me, what happens next? They never saw it coming. For a while, it seemed like everything had settled. After the storm of revelations, my life had fallen into a deceptive lull. Outwardly, I attended book signings, media interviews, and speaking events with a composed smile. I was now the successful author with a powerful story, a symbol of triumph over neglect. The praise was overwhelming, and the accolades filled every corner of my newly built world. Yet beneath that polished veneer, I knew this calm was nothing more than the quiet before the storm. At home, I carried on with my routine as if nothing had changed. I went to classes, met with my writing group, and continued to pen the chapters of my memoir with unwavering determination. Each day, I meticulously planned the next move, aware that my parents might still try to slip back into my life. I maintained a measured distance, a barrier I had built long ago when I first realized how easily they could manipulate the narrative. They tried subtly at first. A phone call here, a vague text there, always laced with the familiar tone of forced concern. My father would say, "We hope you're well, sweetheart," in a voice that sounded more like a sales pitch than genuine care. My mother's messages were equally ambiguous. "Thinking of you," or "Let's catch up soon," followed by long silences. Their attempts were predictable, rehearsed, and always devoid of real emotion. I watched them from afar. Every time I passed an interview or saw a picture from an event online, I caught a glimpse of their smiling faces in the background of a magazine article or a social media post. They were rebranding themselves as part of my success story, positioning themselves as the proud, reformed parents who had finally seen the light. Yet their words were empty. The admiration was manufactured. I knew that beneath their polished exteriors, they were still the same people who had once dismissed and abandoned me. To the world, I appeared to be reconciled with my past, a brave survivor who had turned bitterness into brilliance. I even attended a few family gatherings where they were present, maintaining an icy politeness. In those moments, I smiled, exchanged pleasantries, and spoke about my projects. Yet every laugh felt strained, every compliment laced with an undercurrent of obligation. I couldn't help but notice how they seemed more interested in how I would benefit them than in my genuine well-being. There was one particular evening that encapsulated the falseness of this calm. I was invited to a charity event, organized in part by a foundation that I had inadvertently inspired with my story. My parents were there, side by side, dressed in their finest. They greeted me with warm hugs that felt rehearsed, as if they had practiced the moment 1,000 times. I smiled and exchanged cordial words, but inside, I felt a chill that reminded me of every slight, every dismissal, every hollow "I'm sorry" that never came. Later that night, as I sat in a quiet corner of the venue watching the crowd mingle, I pulled out my phone to check my messages. There, amidst the congratulatory texts from fans and colleagues, was a single email from my mother. It read simply, "Let's talk soon. We miss you." I stared at those few words for what felt like an eternity. They carried the weight of years of neglect and exploitation. In that brief moment, I realized that this calm wasn't peace. It was the calm of predators circling, waiting for the right moment to pounce. I put the phone down and took a deep breath. I had built my new life on truth, on the strength of my own words. I could not allow my past to dictate my future. In that quiet moment, I vowed to maintain the distance I had fought so hard to establish. I would continue to let my work speak for itself, to use my voice as a shield and a weapon. Their reappearance was not a sign of reconciliation. It was a calculated move to reclaim what they had lost. The narrative of my life. Every smile I exchanged with them from that point on was measured, every word carefully chosen. I continued to attend events and engage with my growing audience, but I never let my guard down. The false calm was simply a stage in the larger performance they had orchestrated. I was fully aware that behind that calm lay an impending storm, a reckoning that would expose the hollowness of their regrets. As I stepped away from the glittering lights of the charity event that night, I felt a renewed determination. I had weathered their attempts to reinsert themselves into my life with quiet dignity, and now it was time to let the world know that I was no longer their pawn. The calm they offered was a temporary truce, a prelude to the ultimate unveiling of truth. And soon enough, that storm would break, washing away the pretense and leaving only what was real. Just when I thought I had them figured out, Just when I believed they had no more cards to play, they surprised me, not with kindness, not with remorse, but with audacity. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I got the call. I was on campus, walking out of a guest lecture, my phone vibrating nonstop in my bag. When I finally checked it, I saw 6 missed calls, all from my agent. That wasn't normal. I stepped outside, found a quiet bench, and called her back. "Hey," I said, breathless. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause, a long, heavy one. Then she said, "Have you seen the article?" My stomach turned. "What article?" Another pause. "Your parents gave an interview, a long one. It's already on 3 sites. I felt cold, numb, like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "What? What did they say?" "I think you should read it for yourself." I ended the call and opened my browser with shaking hands. It didn't take long to find. The headline was already trending. "How We Almost Lost Our Daughter. The Untold Story of a Family Reconnecting After Years Apart." My face was on the banner image. A photo from my book launch, the one where I'm smiling, caught off guard by the flash. The article was long, glossy, emotional, full of half-truths. They talked about how I struggled in school, how they had feared for my mental health, how they had given me space to grow, how I had cut off contact, and how they had always quietly supported me from afar. They spoke of redemption and family healing, and how proud they were of the woman I had become. They quoted things I never said, took moments completely out of context, claimed to be behind my book's message of resilience. They made themselves the heroes of my survival story. I sat on that bench, heart racing, hands trembling. I felt like I was drowning in someone else's version of my life. And that's when the real twist came. They had registered a nonprofit. The same foundation idea they'd floated during that lunch? They'd gone ahead with it, without telling me. They named it the Resilience Project, using my name in the tagline, my story in the mission, my quotes on the website. It was real, public, already gathering donations. People thought I was involved. My inbox was flooded with congratulations, praise, interview requests. And underneath all that noise, my phone buzzed again. This time, a message from my mother. "Did you see it? We did it. We're so proud of everything you've become." That was it. The final betrayal. They had taken my life, my story, my pain, and they turned it into a business, a campaign, a narrative they could sell, without my consent, without a single conversation, all because they knew I'd never go public with what really happened. Why? Because I'd protected them. Even after everything, I had never named them, never dragged them into the spotlight. I had been gracious, careful, human, and they used that as their opportunity. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense with rage, but it wasn't the fiery, explosive kind of rage. It was cold, focused, because now I knew one thing with absolute certainty. There was no going back. They had crossed the line. They had weaponized my silence, twisted it into permission, and used it to write themselves into a version of my story where they came out looking like the ones who saved me. They didn't just steal my truth, they monetized it. But they had made one mistake. They underestimated me. Again, they thought I would stay quiet, that I wouldn't want to look dramatic, or ungrateful, or emotional. They thought I was still the girl who needed their approval. What they didn't know was that I had already finished the final chapter of my memoir. And in that chapter I wasn't vague. I didn't speak in metaphors. I told the truth, with names, with dates, with receipts. And it was about to go to print. I didn't scream. I didn't confront them face to face. I didn't post a public takedown or burn bridges in front of an audience. That would have been easy. But revenge? Real revenge? It doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it's a quiet shift in gravity, where everything they built starts to collapse under the weight of its own lies. My first move was simple. I sent an official cease and desist. Through my lawyer. Short, professional, unemotional. It demanded that they remove my name, my likeness, and all references to my personal story from their foundation and promotional materials. It included direct quotes from the article they gave, highlighted in yellow, with corrections in the margins. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of boundaries. One they had never respected before. They ignored it. So I followed through. I contacted every journalist who had ever reached out to me. I sent them the unedited final chapter of my memoir. I gave them the real story. I still didn't name names, but I gave just enough truth to make it clear that the people claiming to be the heroes were, in fact, the villains. I didn't have to destroy them. I just had to let them talk long enough to reveal who they really were. The backlash was immediate. Comment sections turned cold. Followers started asking questions. Donors began pulling support from their foundation, not because I told them to, but because people could smell a fraud. Suddenly, the story wasn't, "Look at this family who overcame their differences." It was, "Why does this family seem to be profiting off someone else's pain?" One of the larger publications that ran their story issued a correction, quietly, but publicly. The Resilience Project website, taken down within a week. And then, the phone calls started. Voicemail after voicemail, each more frantic than the last. "Can we talk? This is getting out of hand. We didn't mean for this to happen. We're your parents." That last one made me laugh. They were only my parents again now that they had something to lose. They didn't call when I was alone and jobless at 19. They didn't call when I published my first book. They didn't call when I built my name from the ground up. But now that their carefully constructed image was cracking, they were desperate. My mother even showed up outside one of my book events. She stood at the edge of the crowd, behind the cameras, behind the fans, behind the smiling faces of people who saw me for who I truly was. When our eyes met, she didn't speak, just stood there, watching. I turned away. Later that night, I got one last message from her. "You've made your point. You've humiliated us. Is that what you wanted?" I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed a reply. "No. What I wanted was to be loved. What I wanted was to matter when it didn't benefit you. What I wanted was a family. What I did was protect myself." Then I blocked the number. No dramatic send-off, no final speech, just silence. Because the most powerful revenge is not destruction, it's disconnection. It's showing the people who broke you that you're no longer willing to let them live in your mind, that they are no longer your authors, that your life, your story, your name, belong to you. My memoir launched 3 weeks later. The final chapter, the one they never thought I'd publish, became the most quoted, the most shared, the most underlined. People read my words and saw through the illusion. They felt the truth. And the best part? I didn't have to explain. I didn't have to expose. I didn't even have to retaliate. All I had to do was tell my story. And in doing so, I reclaimed every piece of myself they tried to erase. In the end, they disappeared just as quietly as they had once erased me. There were no more emails, no more voicemails, no legal threats or dramatic confrontations, just silence. But this time it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like closure, because for the first time in my life, I chose the silence. I chose not to chase, not to explain, not to perform my pain for people who only saw me as useful when it served their story. It was strange, this new quiet. At first, it made me nervous. I kept waiting for something, an attack, a twist, another betrayal. But nothing came, only space, only stillness. And I realized, that's what freedom feels like. Not loud, not dramatic, just uncomplicated. The foundation they tried to build in my name? Shut down. The article they gave interviews for? Buried under fact checks and quiet retractions. The legacy they thought they could rewrite? Dismantled piece by piece. Not by me lashing out, but by simply standing in the truth. I didn't have to scream. I just had to exist without them. And that was enough to collapse the lie. Meanwhile, my career bloomed like nothing I could have imagined. My memoir hit bestseller lists across the country. I was invited to speak at universities, mental health panels, book festivals. I met people who had lived similar stories, people who carried the same invisible wounds I had once mistaken for personality flaws. A young woman came up to me at a signing with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for giving a voice to the daughter I still am." I hugged her tightly, and I knew in that moment, this was my legacy. Not the pain, not the betrayal, the survival, the rebuilding, the truth. I wrote more, not just about trauma, but about healing, about joy, about boundaries, about becoming someone who no longer needs to be small to be safe. I bought my own apartment. Nothing huge, but filled with things I loved. Books, art, candles. I filled it with softness, not because I was weak, but because I had finally learned that softness was my strength. I made new friendships, real ones. The kind where I didn't have to explain why certain holidays were hard. The kind where silence between texts didn't mean punishment. Where vulnerability wasn't used as a weapon. I even reconnected with Daniel. He apologized. Not in the performative way I'd grown used to, but in a quiet, sincere way. He said he had been afraid to challenge our parents, that he saw what was happening but didn't have the courage to speak up. I told him the truth. I don't blame you, but I had to stop waiting for someone else to defend me. I had to learn to do it myself. He nodded, and we started over. Not as siblings burdened by the same house, but as two adults trying to do better than what we were given. One day I got a letter in the mail, handwritten. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from my mother. Inside was a single page. I know you won't respond. I don't expect you to, but I read your book, every page, and I understand now. I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I see it now. I see you. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer, because I had already forgiven her. Not for her sake, but for mine. Because carrying her mistakes in my body was something I no longer had room for. Forgiveness, for me, wasn't an invitation back in. It was a locked door, and peace on the other side. Sometimes people ask me if I miss them, and the truth is, sometimes I miss the idea of them. The idea of having parents who clapped when I walked across the stage, who kept my writing on the fridge, who hugged me for no reason, who loved me without conditions. But that was never who they were, and I've made peace with that. I had to, because if I didn't, I would have kept writing stories where I was always the one trying to earn love. Now, I write stories where I'm already enough, where I'm not waiting for a seat at anyone's table, because I built my own. It happened on a Sunday, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of day that for most people would blur into 100 others. But for me, it was the day I finally let go. I had just returned from a book festival in Portland. It had gone well. Lines out the door, readers crying as they hugged me, people saying my story gave them permission to speak their own pain. I should have been riding the high of it all, but instead, I came home and felt still, not empty, not sad, just still. That's when I knew it was time. There was a box at the back of my closet I had avoided for years. A single box taped shut, marked with a piece of faded masking tape that read, "Old stuff," but I knew what was inside. I had carried it through every move, every phase, every version of myself, never daring to open it. It was like a time capsule I didn't want to disturb. But that day, I pulled it out, sat cross-legged on the living room floor, and peeled back the tape. At first, it was harmless. Yearbooks, a cracked snow globe from a trip to Colorado, notes from high school friends I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. But then I saw it, beneath a stack of notebooks, my old family photo album. I hadn't seen it in years. Hands trembling, I opened it, photo after photo of people smiling with their arms around each other, like nothing had ever gone wrong. Birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings, forced smiles, matching outfits, perfectly arranged chaos. And there I was, always on the edge of the frame, always smiling just enough, always performing. I paused on one photo in particular, my 17th birthday. I was sitting between my parents, a cake in front of me. I remember that moment so clearly, because right after the picture was taken, my dad told me that dreaming is cute, but bills don't get paid with poems. I remember going to bed that night thinking, maybe I'll stop writing. Maybe then they'll be proud. God, if only I could hug that girl. If only she knew what was waiting for her on the other side of all that pain. I kept flipping until I found the letter. A folded-up page stuck between photos, addressed to Future Me. It was in my handwriting, dated 2 days after I left home. I had forgotten all about it. I unfolded it carefully. If you're reading this, it means you didn't go back. It means you survived. I hope you've built something real. I hope you're not still trying to make them love you. I hope you chose yourself. I sat there clutching the page, my throat tight, tears streaming down my face, but not the kind that come from grief. These were tears of confirmation, of proof, because I had survived. I had built something real. And finally, I had chosen myself. That letter wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise. And I had kept it. I stood up slowly and walked to the bookshelf where my memoir sat, my name on the spine, my truth inside every chapter. I took it down, placed the letter inside as a bookmark, and smiled. I don't know what made me do it next. Maybe it was symbolic, maybe it was necessary, but I went to the kitchen, grabbed a lighter, and returned to the photo album. I took it outside, to the fire pit on the balcony. I didn't hesitate. I didn't second-guess it. I set it on fire, page by page. Not in anger, in release. Watching the flames eat away at every false smile, every staged holiday, every lie I had been forced to live. And when it was over, when the last ash drifted into the night, I felt lighter than I ever had. That album was never really a record of my life. It was a record of the version of me they tried to create. The girl who kept shrinking herself for approval, who whispered her dreams instead of shouting them, who begged for love disguised as obligation. That girl was gone, not lost, not broken, transformed. I closed the balcony door behind me and stood there in the dark, watching the city lights blink like stars. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I just felt free. Because sometimes healing doesn't come with fanfare. Sometimes it's just a quiet moment of peace in a life you built from scratch. And as I stood there, barefoot on the cold tile, I whispered one sentence out loud, just for myself. I'm not theirs anymore. And I never would be again. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved? Not because you wanted to, but because staying would have meant losing yourself? That's the hardest part, isn't it? Not the leaving, but the fact that it was necessary. We don't talk enough about the grief that comes with choosing yourself. About the silence that follows when you finally stop chasing people who only saw your worth when it was convenient for them. But if you've ever been there, if you've ever had to rebuild your identity after being told you were too much, or not enough, or only valuable when useful, I want you to know something. You're not alone. And more importantly, you're not broken. Your story, just like mine, doesn't end in rejection. It begins in rediscovery, in reclaiming your voice, in writing your own ending, the one no one thought you were capable of. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut someone out of your life to protect your peace? Have you ever had to become your own family? Your own source of validation? Tell me in the comments. Your voice matters, your story matters, and someone out there, someone still in the middle of it, might need to read what you have to say. If this story touched you, even just a little, leave a like, share it with someone who needs strength, and subscribe, because this isn't the only story like this, and it definitely won't be the last. I'll be right here, telling them, one truth at a time. Until next time, don't wait for someone to give you permission to take up space. You already belong here.